So we're going to talk about World War I on the Western Front. Now, after the United States entered World War I, the German strategy changed completely. What would your goal be as soon as America declared war on them? What did their strategy change to be, considering the information I gave you yesterday?
Walk all.
Well, how good a shape were the Allies in when okay, so what might be your goal if you find out today, America's declared. What's that?
Like take them out first?
Yeah, what their goal was is we got to win the war in Europe before the United States can get here. And remember, General Pershing was taking his time. He was going to train these soldiers. He began the convoy, Admiral Sims began the convoy philosophy of getting supplies and stuff to Great Britain because they were about to starve to death. But the German strategy, or goal, was try to win the war before the United States could get there. Now, in 1918, there were two very important battles that were fought in France before American troops got there. And if the Germans win either one of these battles, war's over. And it won't matter if the United States gets there or not. So if you're the Allies, your goal is to do what in these battles? Not lose. Either tie or win. Okay, but you cannot lose. Okay, these battles are on your ID sheet. The first one occurred on March 21st of 1918. March 21st of 1918. And it was the Battle of the Somme River. Battle of the Somme River. The second of these battles that were fought in France before American troops arrived happened on April 9th of 1918, which was the Battle of the Lys River. So two battles were fought, very important battles, between Germany and the Allies before the United States got to Europe. And a loss in either one of these battles would have meant the end of World War I in favor of Germany. March 21st, 1918, the Battle of the Somme River, and April 9th of 1918, the Battle of the Lys River. During those two battles, the Allies fought Germany to a stalemate. They tied, so to speak. Didn't beat them, but didn't get beat either. And these two stalemates in March and April of 1918 gave the initial time needed for American troops. Remember, they started coming in March of 1918. So, now battles fought between Germany and the Allies are going to include what? Americans, okay? And the first battle that was fought by American soldiers in World War I was the Battle of Chateau Thierry. The Battle of Chateau Thierry. And that battle was fought just 50 miles from Paris. So if the Allies lose this battle at Chateau Thierry, 50 miles from Paris, what's going to happen? War is going to be over. Well, the Allies will be led by French Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch. Ferdinand Foch is going to lead the Allies in this battle at Chateau Thierry. And the goal is the Allies need to force the German army out of the Paris area and back across the Marne River, out of France. Okay? So the Allied strategy at the Battle of Chateau Thierry was to push the Germans out of the area of Paris, France, back across the Marne River. This battle lasted 8 long days. And in the end, the Allies were able to push the Germans out of Paris and back across the Marne River. And this changes the course of World War I forever, because Germany realizes if they're going to win this World War I, it's going to take a long time because the Americans have arrived. So what did they lose a little bit of? What's that?
Territory for one thing.
What did they lose though, mentally?
Oh,
Morale, they lost morale. I mean,
yeah.
they're thinking, gee whiz, we fought for quite a while, we just about had the thing won. Now the Americans jump in and it's going to take a long time to win this thing. And they lost a lot of morale. As a result of that, we're only going to have one more significant battle in World War I, and that's going to happen in September of 1918, and it's going to be called the Battle of Meuse-Argonne. Battle of Meuse-Argonne, September of 1918. So think about these battles. March 1918, April 1918, right? Then our first one shortly after that American soldiers fought in was the Battle of Chateau Thierry. And now the final battle is going to be in September of 1918. So once the Americans got there, it didn't last long because German morale went, we're going to have to fight and lose a lot more lives. Millions of people were killed in this war in Europe prior to the Americans getting there. Millions. Okay? Long fought battle. Well, in the Battle of Meuse-Argonne, the Allies win again. And guess how many American soldiers are in the battle here? 1.2 million. We have sent guys over in force. So 1.2 million Americans fighting in this last battle. And Germany can see that they have no shot. The Battle of Meuse-Argonne turns out to be another Allied victory, and they could keep fighting probably, but they could see nothing happening positively. And the man that was most scared of this was who? Who was the man most scared of this American influence now? Specific man we talked about once before. Who's scared to death? Who thinks he's going to be captured and probably executed?
Kaiser Wilhelm.
Very good, Kaiser Wilhelm II. And what he does on November 9th of 1918 is German Kaiser Wilhelm flees from Germany. Flees from Germany. Because he's afraid that he's going to be captured and killed. Well, you got a leaderless nation now, so what can't be too far down the road? Victory or surrender on the part of the Germans. Well, 2 days later, on November 11th, 1918, which is on your ID sheet because it's significant, a truce was signed ending the Great War, or World War I. And this truce, ironically, was signed on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. And what do we celebrate it today as on the calendar? What do we say on the calendar on November 11th? Armistice Day, the day that we ended World War I. And the treaty was signed actually on the 11th hour, 11 a.m. in the morning, on the 11th day of November, 1918. And so there's no question that the arrival of the United States of America had won the war for the Allies. And on both sides in World War I, over 10 million men were killed. That's a ton of people. 10 million were killed. Why were so many killed? Because of the new technology. You know how many we always forget about civilians. 10 million troops killed on both sides, right? But you know who gets caught in the middle of this always? Civilians. Over 5 million innocent civilians lost their lives in World War I. 5 million. You think about that. 15 million people in Europe killed. Generations were wiped out. You know what I mean? Holy smokes. Those people didn't have children. A whole generation of people was wiped out in World War I. 10 million troops killed on both sides and 5 million civilians. You know how many American casualties? 116,560 killed in action. So 116,560 516 Americans were killed in action.
16 and 16.
16, 1-6. 116, 516. Now, we never want to,
Is that counting like prisoners of war or
no, that just was KIA, killed in action. There are about 200,000 wounded as well. But, you know, that seems like how you don't want to scoff at 116,000, but when you compare that to 10 million on the both sides, the Central Powers and the Allies, you know, we certainly sacrificed. People were killed. I've never been out to the cemetery out here and spent a whole lot of time looking at the military grave sites, but I'd be curious if there's anyone out in the Worland Cemetery that was killed in action in World War I. I don't know, I should go out and find that out. I think there's some buried there that served in World War I, but I wonder if any were killed in action. Now, we actually sent about 4.7 million soldiers to Europe, and that's why the Germans knew if we continue to fight, we're going to lose more and more men, and it's going to take forever if we could even win. So Pershing wasn't screwing around. Okay, he sent 4.7 million soldiers over to Europe. Okay, we'll talk about the last thing, the peace conference in Paris. You obviously got to have a peace conference to talk about the surrender between the people involved. And was President Wilson one of those that was going to be at that peace conference? Certainly was. Now, on December 4th of 1918, President Wilson, how did he get to France? You can go on a plane, because airplanes, weren't transferred to people in airplanes. Went on a ship. Okay, went across the Atlantic on a ship. And he left on December 14th of 1918. It was the first time in United States history that an American president ever traveled to Europe. First time ever. An American president ever traveled to Europe. And he did so on December 4th of 1918. And for the first time in United States history, an American president traveled to Europe. Now, how well was he received in France? Did people in France like him?
Yeah.
Oh, I'll tell you, they sure did. He saved their bacon. And they referred to him as the great peacemaker from America. That's what they called President Wilson, the great peacemaker from America. They were very grateful that he was involved because it saved the day. Well, this peace conference that they had was scheduled in France on January 18th of 1919, and they had it at the Palace of Versailles, which is on your ID sheet. Palace of Versailles.
January what?
January 18th, 1918, it took place at the Palace of Versailles, which tells you that Wilson just didn't get over there in a day, did he? When did he leave? December 4th, and the peace conference was January 18th, so it took him a while to get over there. Because he's going by
1990?
ship. What?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And they're going to have the peace conference in France at the Palace of Versailles. Here is the men that were there. They were known in history as the Big Four. President Wilson of the United States was there. George Clemenceau of France was there. George Clemenceau of France was there. David Lloyd George of Great Britain was there.
Is he Prime Minister? Is that what he was?
Yep. And a fellow by the name of Vittorio Orlando from Italy was there. Why was he there? We talked about Italy much in this whole thing? Why was he there? Wanted to get the spoils of war. He's in Europe, right? So, the Big Four, the four men that came to the peace conference in Versailles were President Wilson of the United States, George Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Now, Wilson was trying to form what we know as a League of Nations. That was his goal. Anybody know what a League of Nations would be called today? The United Nations. Yeah. He was the first one to come up with this concept. He was going to call it the League of Nations. And when he got to this peace conference, he thought, man, I'll talk all these guys into having this League of Nations. And instead of having these alliance problems where one country declares war and it ends up in a mess. We'll sit down and talk about these international events before we end up in a mess like we did in World War I that took 10 million lives and 15 civilians. And when he got there, he's pretty optimistic that he could get that done. Well, he soon found out when he got to the peace conference that those other three leaders were a lot more interested in pursuing their own interests for their own countries than they were putting any League of Nations together. They were a lot more interested in what they were going to get out of the deal. They weren't interested in any kind of a League of Nations. So the peace conference ended without a League of Nations, and President Wilson returned back to the United States incredibly disappointed because he wanted to see a League of Nations. Now, this is kind of the kicker about World War I. When did I say it ended? November 11th, 1918. It really never officially ended until 1921. So we were technically at war with all these countries for 3 years after we signed the peace treaty. Because in order for a peace treaty to be really legitimate, you got to sign one with each of the countries that you were warring against. Okay? Just can't sign one blanket, right? So they never signed separate peace treaties with these countries that we were warring against until 1921. So technically, from November 11th, 1918 to 1921, we actually were still at war with Germany and their allies. Okay? All right, that's kind of it. I thought what I would do, if you would like, if you want me to go run you a review sheet that you can get yourself organized on for tomorrow. So if you can kind of get yourself organized, I'll go do that real quick like, and then we'll spend the rest of the period working on that in groups or individually.
What do you got, Freddie?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, something.
Here's what I think. You want to copy these notes down on yours? On your sheet?
Because I don't like open
That song is gonna be called.
Where's your sheet?
I can buy binders.
Why don't you get it out?
People in the front row.
Copy that. Because I wrote most of the stuff down on that.
Are you doing the thingy? Yeah.
Dude, I hate these things. Have you ever seen a sweatshirt that has
This,
a
yes. What else should I wear?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's still annoying. Like, when you walk, they swing. It's annoying. You're like, or I just end up chewing on the end of it and then the plastic thing gone. And then it just gets frizzy. It's annoying. And then it gets frizzy again. And then you just pop it out. You don't care about it.
So we can get done.
I don't Yo.
I never missed it. I just drew over a scratch.
Mo, guess what? Have fun. How do you know?
It's a choice. Wait.
Your tongue sensitive? Yeah.
I'm cats, but I can just talking I have 4. Each? Not dogs, but not I'll make sure my cat's safe. No, I'll just take care of it. I'll take care of it.
You won't know. Trust me, I didn't tell Zoe I was allergic to cats.
Yeah, but
and we went
yours
to the
probably
Humane Society and we went to the cat room. The best, worst thing that happened is I got hives all the way down my neck.
Yeah, how's that feel with your dress? She doesn't get half, she takes out. I know this because she slept in my house. I have 4 cats.
I have
We know you have 2 cats. Okay, anyway. Let's get back to our phones and then
It's all normal.
I want to get mine done so bad.
You have someone's dying, my parents is watching here now. Yeah, it's going.
I hope they
He grew a regular, and then she worked at 3 days.
Okay,
You're gonna add yes one.
the three of us speaking up. You two are singing.
Sorry.
You were singing something
The older you
else.
get, the more you wanna see
All
it
of them.
done.
Still expensive. I just see that stuff as a waste. Yeah, I feel waste your money.
See, if I had to get my hair done before prom, because there's silver in it. In your hair? Yes, I see it. And it's past that.
Where do we have that?
Alright,
That's why I dyed my hair. I got graded. Get used to it. I got graded.
I had to leave right before we
I'm 16. So we go up and people run online, join hands, and he says, I'm good, get used to it. And we go, what? Yeah.
So what's what I'm
After we
getting?
go, yeah, we jumped out.
I'm sorry.
I'm only wrote two.
Wow, you have a long way to go.
I've gotten all the way through there, but I had to leave right before the last fly.
Yes,
So you test tomorrow, you better write it down.
that was exactly what I'm good, I'm good, I'll have hands, and then you don't like it or you don't like it, and then we'll do a comp. Yeah, it really feels really weird. I was mainly just like, just not complaining about my
Especially when you
brother.
talk.
Because like, me too, I didn't sleep well last night. What was your, did you stay up and do games all night? I didn't, I wasn't gaming.
I was just sitting there.
You.
I can't let my hair on this one ear.